The courtroom fell into stunned silence as the decorated Marine sniper rose from his chair, his hands still cuffed behind his back. What he was about to reveal would not only shock everyone present, but completely change how the entire legal system viewed military veterans returning from war. The judge, who had seen thousands of cases in her 30-year career, would later say this was the moment that restored her faith in humanity. But 12 hours earlier, this same man was being dragged away in handcuffs, labeled as just another criminal by a system that had failed to see the hero beneath the surface. This is not just another story about crime and punishment. This is the extraordinary true account of how one man's darkest moment became the catalyst for a movement that would save thousands of lives. What started as a routine arrest would expose hidden truths about PTSD, reveal the power of community support, and prove that sometimes the most broken people are actually the strongest among us. The events that unfolded in that small-town courtroom would make headlines across the nation, but the real story begins much earlier, in the mountains of Afghanistan, where a young Marine learned that coming home from war can sometimes be the hardest battle of all. Marcus Thompson never imagined his life would take the turns it did when he first walked into the Marine Corps recruitment office in his small hometown of Cedar Falls, Ohio. At 18, he was just another kid from a working-class family, the son of a factory worker and a school cafeteria cook, looking for direction and purpose. His grades were decent, but not exceptional, and college seemed like a distant dream his family couldn't afford. The military offered structure, training, and, most importantly, a chance to serve something bigger than himself. The transformation from small-town teenager to elite Marine sniper didn't happen overnight. Basic training at Parris Island was brutal, designed to break down civilians and rebuild them as Marines. Marcus discovered he had natural abilities that set him apart from his peers. His hand-eye coordination was exceptional, his patience legendary among his drill instructors, and his ability to remain calm under extreme pressure caught the attention of his superiors. But it was his unwavering determination and moral compass that truly distinguished him from the hundreds of other recruits. After completing basic training with honors, Marcus volunteered for additional specialized training. The path to becoming a Marine Scout sniper is one of the most challenging in the military. The grueling 13-week course has a failure rate of over 70%. Candidates must master not only marksmanship, but also advanced reconnaissance, camouflage, and survival techniques. They learn to remain motionless for hours, sometimes days, while gathering intelligence or waiting for the perfect shot. The mental discipline required is as demanding as the physical challenges. Marcus excelled in every aspect of the training. His instructors noted his exceptional ability to calculate wind speed, distance, and environmental factors in seconds. More importantly, they observed his mature understanding of the weight of responsibility that comes with being a sniper. Unlike some candidates who seemed drawn to the role by movies and video games, Marcus understood that every shot he might take in combat would carry moral consequences that would last a lifetime. The first deployment came sooner than expected. At just 20 years old, Marcus found himself in the mountains of Afghanistan, part of a reconnaissance team tasked with gathering intelligence on Taliban movements. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky terrain that provided excellent concealment, but demanded physical endurance that pushed even well-trained Marines to their limits. The temperature swings were extreme, scorching during the day and freezing at night. His team consisted of 4 Marines, each with specialized skills that complemented the others. There was Rodriguez, the communications specialist who could establish contact with command from almost impossible locations. Jenkins served as the spotter, responsible for calculating distance, wind, and other factors that would affect long-range shots. Patterson handled reconnaissance and served as the team medic. Marcus was the designated marksman, the one who would take the shot when necessary. The team's first major mission involved tracking a high-value target who had been responsible for coordinating attacks on supply convoys. Intelligence suggested the target would be moving through a specific mountain pass within a 3-day window. The team positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking the pass, settling in for what could be a long wait. They had prepared for every contingency, but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to witness. On the second day, through his scope, Marcus spotted movement in the valley below. What he saw through his rifle scope would haunt him for years to come. A convoy of vehicles was approaching, but these weren't military targets. They were civilian vehicles, and Marcus could see women and children among the passengers. His training had been clear about rules of engagement and the critical importance of positive target identification, but the situation on the ground was rapidly evolving in ways that Manuel couldn't predict. Suddenly, an explosion rocked the valley as an improvised explosive device detonated near the lead vehicle. The convoy came under immediate attack from Taliban fighters positioned on the opposite ridge. Marcus watched in horror as innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire, scrambling for cover among the rocky terrain. His team immediately contacted command for permission to engage, but the response was delayed due to communication difficulties. In those critical moments, Marcus had to make decisions that would define not only the mission, but his entire military career. Through his scope, he could see Taliban fighters positioning themselves to ambush the civilians who were trying to escape the kill zone. Every second of delay meant more innocent lives at risk. His training and instincts told him to engage the enemy targets, but military protocol required confirmation from command before firing. The internal conflict was agonizing. Marcus had joined the Marines to protect innocent people, but now he faced a situation where following proper procedure might result in civilian casualties. He could see children hiding behind vehicles, terror written across their faces. The enemy fighters were systematically moving to positions where they could eliminate the surviving civilians. Rodriguez was frantically trying to re-establish clear communication with command while Patterson and Jenkins fed Marcus information about enemy positions and movements. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Every moment of hesitation could mean the difference between life and death for the people trapped in the valley below. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than 2 minutes, command authorization came through. Marcus had already identified his targets and calculated his shots. With steady hands and controlled breathing, he began engaging enemy positions. His first shot eliminated a Taliban fighter who was moving to flank the civilian position. The second shot took out a machine gunner who had been raking the convoy with automatic fire. The precision of Marcus's shooting turned the tide of the battle. His team's intervention allowed most of the civilians to escape to safety, and the surviving Taliban fighters retreated deeper into the mountains. When the smoke cleared, Marcus and his team had saved dozens of innocent lives. The mission was considered a tremendous success, and Marcus received commendation for his actions under fire. But success came with a price that wasn't immediately apparent. That night, as Marcus tried to sleep in his position on the mountain, he found himself replaying every moment of the engagement. The image of the terrified children was burned into his memory. Even though he had saved lives, the reality of taking human life, even enemy combatants, weighed heavily on his conscience. This was the beginning of an internal struggle that would follow him long after he returned home. Over the following months, Marcus and his team participated in numerous operations throughout Afghanistan. Each mission brought its own challenges and moral complexities. They gathered intelligence that led to successful operations against Taliban leadership. They provided overwatch for convoy operations, keeping supply lines safe for other American and coalition forces. Their reputation for precision and reliability made them one of the most requested sniper teams in their area of operations. Marcus earned the respect of his peers and superiors not just for his marksmanship skills, but for his leadership and judgment under pressure. He was promoted to lance corporal and then corporal ahead of his peers. His recommendations for Bronze Star and Other commendations reflected his exceptional service and dedication to his fellow Marines and the mission. But with each successful operation, the psychological weight continued to accumulate. Marcus began experiencing nightmares and difficulty sleeping. He started to question whether he was becoming too comfortable with violence. The man who had joined the Marines with a clear moral compass was struggling with the gray areas that define modern warfare. He confided in Rodriguez, who assured him that having doubts was actually a sign of his humanity and moral strength. The turning point came during what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission. Intelligence had indicated that a Taliban commander was using a particular compound as a meeting place. Marcus and his team were tasked with surveillance and gathering information about the facility's occupants and security measures. They positioned themselves on a hillside about 800 meters from the target building and began their observation. What they discovered over the course of their surveillance changed everything. The compound wasn't being used solely for military purposes. It was also serving as a makeshift school for local children. During certain hours of the day, Marcus could see children arriving for lessons, their bright clothing and joyful energy a stark contrast to the harsh military environment surrounding them. The moral complexity of the situation was staggering. The Taliban commander was indeed using the location, but innocent children were also present during parts of the day. Any operation against the compound would have to account for these civilians, particularly the children who had no role in the conflict but whose presence made any military action exponentially more complicated. Marcus and his team spent days documenting patterns of movement and identifying windows of opportunity when the compound might be clear of civilians. Their detailed intelligence gathering and careful analysis ultimately led to a successful operation that captured the Taliban commander without harming any innocent people. But the stress of the situation, combined with months of accumulated combat stress, was beginning to take its toll. The final months of Marcus's deployment were marked by increasingly difficult operations and personal struggles. He had become one of the most effective snipers in his unit, but the cost was becoming apparent to those closest to him. Rodriguez noticed that Marcus had become quieter, more withdrawn. He still performed his duties with the same precision and dedication, but something fundamental had changed. When the time came to rotate back to the United States, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was ready to leave the daily stress and moral complexity of combat operations, but he wasn't sure he was ready to return to civilian life. The skills that had made him successful in Afghanistan didn't necessarily translate to peacetime existence. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in combat zones became anxiety in civilian settings. The ability to make split-second life-or-death decisions seemed less relevant when dealing with everyday problems. The homecoming was everything Marcus had dreamed about during long nights in Afghanistan, but it was also everything he had feared. His family and friends welcomed him as a hero, but he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like someone who had done necessary but terrible things in service of his country. The disconnect between how others saw him and how he saw himself would become one of the central challenges of his transition back to civilian life. As Marcus prepared to leave active duty and return to Ohio, he carried with him not just commendations and awards, but invisible wounds that would prove harder to heal than any physical injury. The boy who had walked into the recruitment office had become a man, but the price of that transformation was only beginning to become apparent. The real battle was just beginning, and it would be fought not in the mountains of Afghanistan, but in the quiet streets of his hometown, where the enemy was invisible and the rules of engagement were nowhere to be found. The transition from war zone to hometown should have been a celebration, but for Marcus Thompson, returning to Cedar Falls felt like landing on an alien planet. The small Ohio town he had left 3 years earlier seemed simultaneously exactly the same and completely foreign. The same streets, the same shops, even many of the same faces, but everything felt different through eyes that had seen too much. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in Afghanistan became a constant source of anxiety in peaceful suburban settings. His family had prepared a welcome home party that reflected their pride and relief at having their son back safely. Friends from high school, neighbors, and family members gathered in the backyard of his childhood home, eager to hear stories and celebrate his service. The yellow ribbon magnets and American flags decorating the space represented the community's genuine appreciation for his sacrifice, but Marcus felt like he was watching the celebration from outside his own body. People asked questions he couldn't answer honestly without destroying their perception of war and military service. They wanted to hear about heroic moments and clear victories, but Marcus's memories were filled with moral ambiguity and psychological complexity that didn't translate into comfortable dinner table conversation. When his uncle asked about his kill count, Marcus felt physically sick. The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what his service had actually entailed and the weight it carried. His parents, Jim and Sandra Thompson, had always been his strongest supporters, but they struggled to understand the changes they observed in their son. The confident, outgoing young man who had left for the Marines had returned quieter, more reserved, and prone to startling at unexpected sounds. They attributed these changes to normal readjustment stress and believed that time and familiar surroundings would restore him to his former self. Marcus attempted to return to some semblance of normal life by enrolling in a local community college using his GI Bill benefits. He chose a program in criminal justice, thinking that his military experience and discipline might translate well to law enforcement. The structured environment of classes and assignments provided some stability, but he struggled with concentration and found himself constantly scanning rooms for exits and potential threats. His fellow students were mostly recent high school graduates who seemed impossibly young and naive to Marcus. Their concerns about test scores and social activities felt trivial compared to the life and death decisions he had faced overseas. He tried to connect with his classmates, but found the generational gap created by his combat experience difficult to bridge. The age difference was only a few years, but the experiential gap was enormous. Sleep became an ongoing battle. The nightmares that had begun in Afghanistan intensified after his return home. He would wake up in cold sweats, sometimes unsure of where he was or what year it was. The dreams weren't always direct replays of combat experiences. Sometimes they were twisted scenarios where he failed to protect innocent people or made wrong decisions that resulted in catastrophic consequences. The guilt and self-doubt that had been manageable during active duty became overwhelming in the quiet of civilian life. Marcus found temporary relief in physical exercise, pushing his body to exhaustion in hopes of achieving peaceful sleep. He would run for miles through the countryside surrounding Cedar Falls, his pace driven by an internal urgency that civilian life couldn't satisfy. The physical demands helped temporarily quiet his racing thoughts, but they also isolated him further from friends and family who couldn't understand his compulsive need for intense physical activity. His relationship with Sarah, his high school girlfriend who had waited for him during his deployment, became another casualty of his difficult transition. She had maintained correspondence throughout his time overseas and had eagerly anticipated his return. But the man who came home was fundamentally different from the boy she had said goodbye to. Marcus struggled to be emotionally present and found himself withdrawing when conversations became too intimate or personal. Sarah tried to be patient and understanding, but Marcus's emotional unavailability and unpredictable moods strained their relationship beyond its breaking point. Arguments that should have been minor disagreements escalated into major conflicts because Marcus couldn't regulate his emotional responses appropriately. The anger that had been a useful tool in combat situations became destructive in personal relationships. The breakup was devastating for Marcus, confirming his growing belief that he was fundamentally damaged and incapable of maintaining normal human connections. He interpreted Sarah's decision to end their relationship as evidence that he was irreparably broken, not as a normal consequence of two people growing apart under difficult circumstances. This perception fed into a growing cycle of self-isolation and depression. Employment proved to be another significant challenge. Despite his exemplary military record and specialized training, employers in Cedar Falls didn't know how to evaluate his experience or integrate his skills into civilian positions. The precision and attention to detail that had made him an exceptional sniper were valuable traits, but explaining his military background often led to uncomfortable conversations about his combat experience. Marcus eventually found work at a local security company, hoping that his military background would be an asset. The job involved monitoring security cameras and responding to alarm calls at various commercial properties around town. The work was often boring and routine, a stark contrast to the high-stakes environment he had grown accustomed to in Afghanistan. However, the quiet overnight shifts suited his current mental state and allowed him to avoid most social interactions. His supervisor, a former police officer named Dave Martinez, recognized signs of combat stress in Marcus and tried to provide support and understanding. Dave had worked with other veterans over the years and understood that the transition to civilian employment could be particularly challenging for those with combat experience. He offered Marcus flexibility in scheduling and assignments, trying to create an environment where he could succeed. But even this understanding work environment couldn't address the underlying issues Marcus was struggling with. He began experiencing what psychologists would later identify as classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time, he didn't understand what was happening to him. The hypervigilance, emotional numbing, intrusive memories, and difficulty concentrating were textbook PTSD symptoms, but mental health resources for veterans in small towns like Cedar Falls were extremely limited. The stigma surrounding mental health issues, particularly among military veterans, prevented Marcus from seeking help even when he began to recognize that something was seriously wrong. The Marine Corps culture had emphasized mental toughness and self-reliance, values that made it difficult to admit psychological struggles or ask for help. Seeking mental health treatment felt like admitting weakness or failure, concepts that were antithetical to his military identity. Marcus began self-medicating with alcohol, a common but dangerous coping mechanism among combat veterans. What started as an occasional beer to help him relax gradually escalated into regular drinking sessions designed to numb his emotional pain and quiet his racing thoughts. Alcohol provided temporary relief from his symptoms, but ultimately made his underlying problems worse. His family watched with growing concern as Marcus became increasingly isolated and dependent on alcohol. They tried to encourage him to seek help, but their suggestions were met with resistance and denial. Marcus insisted that he just needed time to adjust and that the problems would resolve themselves naturally. This denial was partly protective, as acknowledging the severity of his issues felt like admitting that his military service had irreparably damaged him. The downward spiral accelerated when Marcus began having panic attacks in public places. The first incident occurred in a crowded grocery store when a combination of fluorescent lights, background noise, and numerous people moving unpredictably triggered an overwhelming anxiety response. Marcus felt his heart racing, his palms sweating, and an intense need to escape the environment immediately. He abandoned his shopping cart and fled the store, leaving him shaken and embarrassed. These panic attacks became more frequent and unpredictable, further limiting Marcus's ability to function in normal social and professional environments. He began avoiding crowds, movie theaters, restaurants, and other places where he felt trapped or unable to maintain situational awareness. This avoidance behavior provided short-term relief, but reinforced his anxiety and further isolated him from potential sources of support. His work performance began to suffer as his concentration problems worsened and his anxiety increased. Dave Martinez continued to be supportive, but the security company had professional obligations that limited how much accommodation they could provide. Marcus was written up for several minor incidents, including falling asleep on duty due to his chronic insomnia, and failing to complete required paperwork because of concentration difficulties. The financial stress of irregular employment added another layer of difficulty to Marcus's already overwhelming situation. His family offered financial support, but accepting help felt like another admission of failure. The independence and self-sufficiency that had been central to his identity as a Marine seemed impossible to maintain as a struggling civilian veteran. Late at night, during his security shifts, Marcus would often find himself reliving specific moments from his deployment. The image of the terrified children during that first firefight remained particularly vivid, along with the weight of responsibility he had felt when making split-second decisions that affected innocent lives. He began questioning whether his actions overseas had been morally justified, even though his rational mind understood that he had saved lives and followed proper procedures. This moral injury, the psychological wound that results from perpetrating, witnessing, or failing to prevent acts that violate one's moral beliefs, became one of the most difficult aspects of Marcus's struggle. Unlike physical wounds that heal with time and medical treatment, moral injury requires a complex process of acknowledgement, understanding, and sometimes forgiveness that can take years to achieve. The isolation and self-medication continued to worsen throughout his first year back home. Marcus's world had gradually shrunk to include only work, his apartment, and the liquor store. He stopped attending family gatherings, avoided his old friends, and declined invitations to social events. His parents' attempts to maintain connection became increasingly strained as Marcus pushed away their offers of help and support. The moment that would change everything was still months away, but the foundation for crisis was being laid every day. Marcus was trapped in a cycle of isolation, self-medication, and declining mental health that would eventually lead to the incident that brought him to the attention of law enforcement. The hero who had saved lives in Afghanistan was slowly losing his battle with invisible enemies at home, and the community that had celebrated his return remained largely unaware of his struggle. The irony was devastating. The same skills and training that had made him exceptional in combat were now making his civilian life unbearable. The vigilance that had protected his fellow Marines became anxiety that prevented him from enjoying simple pleasures. The moral certainty that had guided his military service was replaced by confusion and self-doubt that undermined his sense of purpose and identity. Marcus Thompson was fighting the hardest battle of his life, and he was fighting it alone. The night that changed everything started like countless others for Marcus Thompson. His shift at the security company had ended at 6 in the morning, and he drove home through the empty streets of Cedar Falls as the sun began to rise over the Ohio countryside. The 12-hour shift monitoring security cameras had been uneventful, filled with the mind-numbing routine of checking empty office buildings and retail stores. The monotony was both a blessing and a curse. It paid the bills, but left too much time for his thoughts to wander to places he didn't want them to go. Marcus's apartment was a sparse, functional space that reflected his current mental state. Military precision still governed his organization of personal items, but there was an emptiness to the place that went beyond minimalism. The walls were bare except for a single framed photo of his Marine unit taken before their final mission in Afghanistan. The image served as both a source of pride and a painful reminder of the camaraderie he had lost when he returned to civilian life. Sleep had been particularly elusive lately, and despite his exhaustion, Marcus found himself staring at the ceiling as morning light filtered through his blinds. The familiar cocktail of anxiety and depression had intensified over the past several weeks, triggered by the approaching anniversary of his most difficult day in Afghanistan. The human mind's ability to track traumatic anniversaries, even unconsciously, was wreaking havoc on his already fragile psychological state. By noon, Marcus had given up on sleep entirely. He made coffee and tried to focus on homework for his criminal justice classes, but the words on the page seemed to blur together. Concentration had become increasingly difficult, and even simple tasks required enormous mental effort. The coursework that had once seemed manageable now felt overwhelming. Another reminder of how different he had become since his deployment. The decision to leave his apartment and drive around town wasn't really a decision at all. It was more of a compulsion, an attempt to escape the claustrophobic feeling that had been building for days. He found himself driving the familiar streets of his childhood, past his old high school, through the downtown area where he had worked summer jobs before joining the Marines, around the neighborhoods where his friends' families still lived normal, peaceful lives. The contrast between the quiet suburban streets and his memories of Afghanistan was jarring. Children played in front yards while their mothers watched from porches. Teenagers walked home from school laughing and talking about typical adolescent concerns. Elderly couples worked in their gardens enjoying the mild spring weather. It was exactly the kind of peaceful American life he had fought to protect overseas, but instead of feeling proud or satisfied, Marcus felt disconnected and alienated. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother asking if he wanted to come for dinner that evening. Sandra Thompson had been persistently trying to maintain connection with her son, despite his increasing tendency to isolate himself. Her messages were always cheerful and optimistic, filled with news about neighbors, family members, and community events that she hoped might spark some interest or engagement from Marcus. Instead of responding to the message, Marcus turned off his phone and continued driving. He wasn't ready to put on the mask of normalcy that family interactions required. Pretending to be okay had become exhausting, and he didn't have the energy to maintain the facade that evening. His parents deserved better than a son who couldn't even manage basic conversation without feeling overwhelmed, but he didn't know how to give them what they needed. The drive took him past the Veterans Affairs office in the neighboring town, a small building that housed limited resources for local veterans. Marcus had driven past it dozens of times over the past year, but had never stopped. The stigma associated with mental health treatment, combined with his own stubborn belief that he should be able to handle his problems independently, had prevented him from seeking the help that was available. A sign in the window advertised support groups for combat veterans, but the idea of sitting in a room talking about his experiences with strangers felt impossible. The thought of verbalizing his struggles, of admitting out loud that the decorated Marine sniper couldn't adjust to civilian life, triggered intense feelings of shame and failure. Military culture had taught him that showing weakness was dangerous, and seeking help felt like the ultimate admission of weakness. As afternoon turned to evening, Marcus found himself at a liquor store on the outskirts of town. Alcohol had become his primary coping mechanism, the only thing that seemed to quiet the constant noise in his head and provide temporary relief from his symptoms. He told himself it was just for tonight, that he would cut back tomorrow, but these promises had become meaningless rituals that preceded increasingly frequent drinking sessions. The clerk behind the counter was a young man about Marcus's age who had graduated from the same high school a few years behind him. The recognition in his eyes was painful. He clearly remembered Marcus as the local hero who had joined the Marines and served overseas with distinction. The clerk thanked him for his service with genuine warmth and respect, unaware that his gratitude only deepened Marcus's sense of fraudulence and failure. Back in his apartment, Marcus opened a bottle of whiskey and tried to numb the growing anxiety that had been building throughout the day. The alcohol provided temporary relief, but it also loosened the tight control he normally maintained over his emotions and memories. Instead of the peaceful oblivion he was seeking, the drinking session triggered an intense episode of intrusive memories and emotional flashbacks. The anniversary trauma was hitting him full force. Suddenly, he was back in Afghanistan, watching through his scope as enemy fighters positioned themselves to ambush innocent civilians. The weight of responsibility, the pressure of making split-second decisions that would determine who lived and who died, crashed over him with devastating intensity. The rational part of his mind knew he was in his apartment in Ohio, but his nervous system was responding as if he were still in active combat. The panic attack that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced before. His heart pounded so hard he thought he might be having a heart attack. His hands shook uncontrollably. Sweat poured down his face despite the cool evening temperature, and he felt like he couldn't get enough air into his lungs. The walls of his apartment seemed to be closing in, and he felt an overwhelming need to escape. In his altered state of consciousness, influenced by alcohol and overwhelmed by psychological distress, Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He grabbed his keys and left his apartment, convinced that he needed to get somewhere safe, though he had no clear idea where that might be. The combination of PTSD symptoms, alcohol, and panic had impaired his judgment to the point where he wasn't thinking clearly about consequences or alternatives. Driving while intoxicated and psychologically compromised was dangerous enough, but Marcus's destination made the situation exponentially worse. Some unconscious part of his mind directed him toward the elementary school where his mother had worked when he was a child. In his confused state, the school represented safety and security, a place where he had felt protected and cared for during his own childhood. The school building was dark and empty, classes having ended hours earlier. Marcus parked his car in a lot and sat in the darkness, trying to regain control of his breathing and his thoughts. The panic was beginning to subside, replaced by a deep exhaustion that made him feel like his bones were made of lead. He closed his eyes and tried to center himself, using breathing techniques he had learned in the military. What Marcus didn't realize was that his presence on school property after hours had triggered automatic security protocols. Motion detectors had registered his vehicle, and the alarm company had followed standard procedure by notifying local law enforcement. Within minutes, patrol cars were dispatched to investigate what appeared to be a potential break-in or suspicious activity at the elementary school. The first police officer to arrive was Janet Rodriguez, a 5-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department who took her community protection duty seriously. She approached the situation with appropriate caution, unsure what she might encounter. When she spotted a vehicle in the school parking lot with someone inside, she followed protocol by calling for backup before making contact with the individual. Officer Rodriguez had no way of knowing that the man in the car was a decorated combat veteran experiencing a severe PTSD episode. To her, he was simply an unknown person on school property after hours, potentially under the influence of alcohol, in a situation that required careful assessment and appropriate response. Her training emphasized the safety of schools and the protection of children, making her approach necessarily cautious and professional. When backup arrived, the officers approached Marcus's vehicle with standard officer safety procedures. They identified themselves and requested that he exit the vehicle, but Marcus was still struggling with the disorientation and confusion that followed his panic attack. His responses were slow and unclear, and the smell of alcohol on his breath confirmed the officer's suspicions about intoxication. The situation escalated quickly due to a series of miscommunications and misunderstandings. Marcus's military training had conditioned him to respond to authority with respect and compliance, but his current psychological state made it difficult for him to process commands clearly or respond appropriately. The officers interpreted his confusion and delayed responses as potential signs of defiance or danger. When Officer Rodriguez asked Marcus to step out of the vehicle for field sobriety testing, his movements were unsteady due to both alcohol consumption and the physical aftermath of his panic attack. The combination made him appear more intoxicated than he actually was, and his military bearing was misinterpreted as potential aggression by officers who didn't understand his background. The discovery of military identification in Marcus's wallet should have provided important context, but the officers were focused on the immediate situation and the potential threat to school security. Their primary concern was determining whether Marcus posed a danger to the community, particularly given his presence at a school facility. The specific details of his military service and current struggles were not apparent in the tense atmosphere of the traffic stop. Marcus tried to explain that he wasn't trying to break into the school or cause any problems, but His words came out garbled and confused. The stress of the police interaction was triggering additional anxiety symptoms, making it even more difficult for him to communicate clearly or demonstrate that he wasn't a threat. Every attempt to explain himself seemed to make the situation worse. The officers made the decision to place Marcus under arrest for public intoxication and trespassing on school property. The handcuffs felt cold against his wrists as they secured his hands behind his back, and the reality of his situation began to penetrate through his confused mental state. The local hero who had served his country with distinction was being arrested like a common criminal, and he had no idea how to process this devastating turn of events. As Marcus was placed in the back of the patrol car, he experienced a moment of clarity that was perhaps more painful than the confusion had been. He realized that his life had spiraled completely out of control, that he had reached a point where his mental health struggles were endangering not only himself, but potentially others. The shame and self-loathing that had been building for months reached a crescendo as the police car pulled away from the school. The drive to the county jail passed in a haze of disbelief and despair. Marcus stared out the window at the familiar streets of his hometown, wondering how he had gone from being a respected Marine sniper to being arrested at an elementary school. The distance between his past identity as a protector and his current reality as someone who needed protection from himself seemed impossible to bridge. Processing at the jail was routine and impersonal, a series of procedures designed to catalog and contain rather than understand or help. Marcus's military awards and decorations were meaningless in this context. He was simply another person who had been arrested for alcohol-related offenses. The booking officer who took his fingerprints had no idea that those same hands had once saved innocent lives in Afghanistan. The holding cell was small and stark, containing only a metal bench and a toilet. Marcus sat in the corner and tried to make sense of what had happened. The alcohol was beginning to wear off, replaced by a crushing hangover that made his head pound and his stomach churn. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of realizing how far he had fallen. The morning of Marcus Thompson's court appearance dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over his family since his arrest 3 weeks earlier. His parents, Jim and Sandra Thompson, sat in their kitchen struggling to eat breakfast while discussing strategy with Marcus's court-appointed attorney, Jennifer Walsh. The public defender was a dedicated professional who had handled hundreds of cases, but she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. Attorney Walsh had spent considerable time reviewing Marcus's military records, which told a story of exceptional service and personal sacrifice that seemed completely at odds with the charges he was facing. The disconnect between his decorated military career and his current circumstances suggested underlying issues that the criminal justice system was ill-equipped to address through traditional means. She recognized that this case required a different approach, one that addressed root causes rather than simply punishing symptoms. Marcus himself had spent the 3 weeks since his arrest in a state of profound depression and self-reflection. The shock of being arrested had initially pushed him deeper into isolation and self-loathing, but gradually it had also forced him to confront the severity of his mental health struggles. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he was beginning to understand that his problems weren't character flaws that he could overcome through willpower alone. The night before his court appearance, Marcus had finally called the Veterans Affairs office and spoken with a counselor who specialized in PTSD treatment. The conversation had been difficult and emotional, but it had also provided the first glimmer of hope he had felt in months. The counselor had explained that his symptoms were common among combat veterans and that effective treatments were available. More importantly, she had helped him understand that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness. Sandra Thompson had spent the previous evening writing a letter to the judge, pouring out her heart about her son's military service and the struggles he had faced since returning home. She wrote about the young man who had left for the Marines full of purpose and determination, and the wounded veteran who had returned carrying invisible scars that his family hadn't known how to help heal. Her letter was a mother's plea for understanding and compassion rather than punishment. The courthouse in downtown Cedar Falls was a modest building that reflected the small-town character of the community. Built in the 1950s, it had served generations of local families dealing with legal matters ranging from traffic violations to serious felonies. Judge Maria Santos had presided over this courtroom for 15 years, earning a reputation for fairness and wisdom that was respected throughout the county. Judge Santos had reviewed Marcus's case file the evening before his appearance, and she had been struck by the same disconnect that had troubled his attorney. The military records painted a picture of an exemplary service member who had risked his life to protect others, while the arrest report described someone who appeared to be struggling with serious personal problems. She had seen similar cases before and understood that the criminal justice system often failed veterans who needed treatment rather than punishment. As court proceedings began that morning, the gallery was unusually full for a routine misdemeanor case. Word had spread through the community about Marcus's arrest, and many people had come to show their support. His former high school teachers sat alongside neighbors who had watched him grow up. Veterans from previous conflicts had driven from surrounding counties to demonstrate solidarity with a fellow service member who was struggling with the aftermath of war. The presence of so many community members created an atmosphere that was both supportive and emotionally charged. These were people who remembered Marcus as the young man who had volunteered to serve his country, and they struggled to reconcile that memory with the circumstances that had brought him before the court. Their presence represented the community's investment in his well-being and their belief that he deserved a second chance. Marcus entered the courtroom wearing his only suit, an outfit he had purchased years earlier for formal Marine Corps functions. Despite the circumstances, he maintained the military bearing that had been ingrained through years of training. He stood at attention when addressing the judge and spoke in the clear, respectful tone that reflected his military background. However, those who knew him well could see the weight of shame and depression in his shoulders and the exhaustion in his eyes. Attorney Walsh began her presentation by acknowledging the seriousness of the charges while providing context about her client's military service and current struggles. She read portions of his military records, describing specific instances of heroism and dedication that demonstrated his character and commitment to protecting others. The courtroom fell silent as she described a firefight where Marcus had saved civilian lives, risking his own safety to protect innocent people caught in a war zone. The attorney then addressed the more difficult topic of PTSD and its effects on veterans returning from combat. She explained how the same skills and mindset that had made Marcus effective in Afghanistan had become liabilities in civilian life. The hypervigilance that had kept him alive in a war zone had manifested as anxiety and panic in peaceful settings. The moral certainty required for military operations had been replaced by confusion and self-doubt that undermined his sense of identity and purpose. When Attorney Walsh called Marcus to testify on his own behalf, the courtroom atmosphere became even more intense. Marcus approached the witness stand with the same precision he had once used approaching a sniper position, but his usual confidence was replaced by vulnerability and uncertainty. Judge Santos observed him carefully, noting the signs of someone who was struggling with severe internal conflict. Under gentle questioning from his attorney, Marcus began to describe his experiences in Afghanistan and his difficulties adjusting to civilian life. His voice was steady, but quiet as he spoke about the weight of responsibility he had carried as a sniper, the split-second decisions that had determined life and death for others, and the moral complexity of modern warfare that couldn't be easily categorized as right or wrong. The turning point came when Attorney Walsh asked Marcus to describe the night of his arrest. Instead of offering excuses or minimizing his actions, Marcus took full responsibility for his poor judgment while providing context about his psychological state. He described the panic attack that had overwhelmed him, the confusion and disorientation that had impaired his decision-making, and the desperate need to find somewhere safe that had led him to the school parking lot. As Marcus spoke, his military composure began to crack slightly. The emotional walls he had built to protect himself from pain also prevented him from connecting with others. But in this moment of vulnerability, his true character began to emerge. He spoke about his love for his community and his horror at the thought that his actions might have frightened anyone. The man who had dedicated his life to protecting others was devastated by the possibility that he might have become a source of fear. Judge Santos interrupted his testimony to ask a question that surprised everyone in the courtroom. She asked Marcus what he had been thinking about during the moments before his arrest, what had been going through his mind as he sat in the school parking lot. The question was unusual because it invited introspection rather than focusing on facts and legal consequences. Marcus paused for a long moment before answering, struggling to find words for experiences that defied easy description. He spoke about feeling disconnected from the world around him, about carrying memories and experiences that he couldn't share with anyone who hadn't been there. He described the loneliness of being surrounded by people who saw him as a hero while feeling like a failure inside. Most powerfully, he spoke about his fear that he was irreparably damaged and would never again be able to contribute positively to his community. The honesty and vulnerability of his testimony had a profound effect on everyone present. Many people in the gallery were crying, including hardened veterans who recognized their own struggles in Marcus's words. Judge Santos herself was visibly moved, not just by the emotional impact of his story, but by the courage it took to speak so honestly about his darkest moments. Attorney Walsh then called an unexpected witness, Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychiatrist who specialized in treating combat veterans with PTSD. Dr. Williams had volunteered to evaluate Marcus after learning about his case through the Veterans Affairs Office. Her testimony provided crucial context about the psychological aftermath of combat and the specific challenges faced by military snipers who carried unique moral burdens related to their role in warfare. Dr. Williams explained that Marcus's symptoms were consistent with severe PTSD complicated by moral injury, a condition that resulted from actions or the inability to take action that violated deeply held moral beliefs. She described how the precision and life-or-death responsibility of sniper duties created particular psychological vulnerabilities that weren't always recognized or addressed by standard military mental health protocols. The psychiatrist's testimony was clinically detailed but accessible to the lay audience. She explained how untreated PTSD could lead to self-medication with alcohol, social isolation, and increasingly poor judgment as individuals struggled to cope with overwhelming psychological distress. Most importantly, she testified that effective treatments existed and that veterans like Marcus could recover and become productive community members with appropriate support and intervention. When Dr. Williams concluded her testimony, Attorney Walsh made an unusual request. Instead of asking for a reduced sentence or standard probation, she proposed that Marcus be allowed to participate in a specialized veterans treatment court program that had recently been established in a neighboring county. The program combined accountability with therapeutic intervention, addressing the root causes of legal problems rather than simply punishing their symptoms. The prosecution, represented by Assistant District Attorney Michael Chun, had initially approached the case as a straightforward public intoxication and trespassing matter. However, the testimony he had heard changed his perspective significantly. Chun acknowledged that traditional prosecution wouldn't serve the interests of justice or public safety in this case. Instead, he supported the defense request for alternative treatment-focused disposition. Judge Santos called for a brief recess to consider her options. During the break, Marcus was approached by several veterans in the gallery who shared their own stories of struggle and recovery. Their support was overwhelming and unexpected, representing the kind of community connection that had been missing from his life since returning from deployment. For the first time in months, Marcus felt like he wasn't facing his challenges alone. When court resumed, Judge Santos delivered a decision that would become a model for other jurisdictions dealing with similar cases. She suspended Marcus's sentence contingent on his successful completion of the Veterans Treatment Court Program, regular participation in PTSD therapy, and community service specifically designed to help other struggling veterans. Her decision recognized that punishment alone wouldn't address the underlying issues that had led to his arrest. But Judge Santos wasn't finished. In an unprecedented move, she asked Marcus to remain standing and addressed him directly about his value to the community. She spoke about the courage he had shown both in Afghanistan and in the courtroom that day, emphasizing that seeking help for mental health struggles required the same kind of bravery that had made him an effective Marine sniper. The judge's words had a transformative effect, not just on Marcus, but on everyone present. She reframed his struggle with PTSD not as a character flaw, but as a service-connected injury that deserved treatment and support. Her perspective helped Marcus begin to see himself not as a broken veteran, but as someone whose experiences could help other service members avoid similar struggles. As the hearing concluded, Marcus was surrounded by community members offering support and encouragement. Veterans organizations pledged assistance with his treatment and recovery. Local businesses offered employment opportunities that would accommodate his therapy schedule. Most importantly, his parents embraced their son with a mixture of relief and hope that had been absent for too long. 6 months after that transformative day in court, Marcus Thompson stood before a group of newly returned veterans in the basement of the Cedar Falls Community Center. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating folding chairs arranged in a circle and a coffee station that had become the unofficial gathering point for informal conversations before and after meetings. This weekly support group had become the cornerstone of Marcus's recovery and the foundation for what would eventually become a nationally recognized program. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first weeks following his court appearance had been filled with intense therapy sessions that forced Marcus to confront memories and emotions he had been avoiding for years. Dr. Patricia Williams, the psychiatrist who had testified on his behalf, became his primary therapist, guiding him through evidence-based treatments specifically designed for combat-related PTSD and moral injury. Cognitive processing therapy had been particularly challenging, but ultimately effective in helping Marcus understand the connection between his thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. The treatment required him to write detailed accounts of his most traumatic experiences, including the firefight where he had saved civilian lives. Initially, this exercise had seemed impossible and counterproductive, but gradually it helped him process the guilt and moral confusion that had been consuming him since his deployment. The written exercises forced Marcus to examine his beliefs about responsibility, control, and moral agency in combat situations. He had been carrying guilt about taking human life, even though his actions had prevented greater loss of innocent life. Dr. Williams helped him understand that moral injury often resulted from the impossible choices that combat situations created, where all available options involved some degree of moral compromise. Prolonged exposure therapy had addressed his avoidance behaviors and helped him gradually confront situations that triggered his anxiety. Under careful clinical supervision, Marcus learned to tolerate increasing levels of stress and uncertainty without resorting to alcohol or isolation. The process was exhausting and sometimes overwhelming, but it slowly restored his confidence in his ability to handle civilian challenges. The Veterans Treatment Court Program had provided structure and accountability during his recovery process. Monthly appearances before Judge Santos created regular checkpoints for monitoring his progress and addressing any emerging challenges. The program's combination of therapeutic intervention and legal oversight ensured that Marcus remained engaged in treatment, even when the process became difficult or discouraging. Community service requirements had connected Marcus with other veterans organizations throughout the region, exposing him to successful recovery stories that provided hope and practical guidance. He had worked with Habitat for Humanity, building homes for veteran families, staffed phone lines at Veterans Crisis Centers, and assisted with administrative tasks at the Veterans Affairs Office. Each experience had contributed to rebuilding his sense of purpose and connection to his community. The most significant breakthrough had come during a therapy session where Dr. Williams helped Marcus reframe his military experience in terms of skills and strengths rather than just trauma and loss. His ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, his attention to detail, his commitment to protecting others, and his experience with life-or-death decision-making were all valuable assets that could benefit civilian communities if properly channeled. This reframing led to Marcus's involvement with the local police department as a civilian consultant on crisis intervention and de-escalation techniques. His military experience with rules of engagement and his personal understanding of PTSD symptoms made him uniquely qualified to help law enforcement officers recognize and appropriately respond to veterans in crisis. The irony wasn't lost on him that his arrest had led to a role helping prevent similar situations for other veterans. Officer Janet Rodriguez, who had arrested Marcus that night at the elementary school, became one of his strongest supporters and closest collaborators. She had been haunted by the arrest, recognizing afterward that Marcus had needed help rather than incarceration. Her advocacy for better police training on veteran issues had led to the crisis intervention partnership that Marcus now helped coordinate. The support group that Marcus now facilitated had grown from an informal gathering of 5 veterans to a structured program, serving over 30 participants from throughout the region. The group met weekly and provided a safe space for veterans to share their experiences, learn coping strategies, and support each other through the challenges of civilian transition. Marcus's personal experience with both combat trauma and recovery made him an effective peer counselor who could relate to participants' struggles without judgment. Each support group session followed a structured format that balanced education with emotional support. Marcus would begin with brief check-ins that allowed participants to share current challenges or successes. Educational segments covered topics like recognizing PTSD symptoms, managing anxiety and depression, rebuilding relationships, and navigating veterans' benefits. The sessions always concluded with time for open discussion and mutual support among group members. Marcus had learned that his role wasn't to provide therapy or clinical treatment, but rather to offer hope through his own example and facilitate connections among veterans who shared similar experiences. Many participants arrived at their first meeting feeling isolated and hopeless, believing that their struggles were unique and insurmountable. Seeing Marcus's transformation from arrest to recovery demonstrated that healing was possible even after hitting rock bottom. The success of the support group had attracted attention from veterans organizations throughout Ohio and neighboring states. Marcus had been invited to speak at conferences, consult with other communities developing veteran support programs, and train mental health professionals who worked with combat veterans. His story had been featured in veterans publications and local media, but he was always careful to emphasize that recovery required professional treatment and community support rather than individual heroism. One of the most rewarding aspects of Marcus's new role was working with recently returned veterans who were experiencing early signs of adjustment difficulties. His own delayed recognition of PTSD symptoms had taught him the importance of early intervention and prevention. By sharing his story with newly returned service members, he hoped to help them seek treatment before their problems became as severe as his had been. Marcus's relationship with his family had been completely transformed through his recovery process. His parents had participated in family therapy sessions that helped them understand PTSD and learn how to provide appropriate support without enabling destructive behaviors. The communication skills they developed had rebuilt trust and intimacy that had been damaged by years of Marcus's isolation and emotional unavailability. His romantic life had also stabilized after he began dating Rebecca, a nurse at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center who understood the challenges faced by combat veterans. Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully, with both partners aware of the importance of maintaining Marcus's recovery while building healthy intimacy. Rebecca's professional experience with veterans had prepared her for the unique aspects of dating someone with PTSD, and her support had been crucial to Marcus's continued healing. The elementary school where Marcus had been arrested had become an unlikely symbol of his transformation. He now volunteered there as a mentor for children whose parents were deployed overseas with the military. His calm presence and understanding of military culture made him particularly effective at helping these children cope with the stress and uncertainty of having a parent in harm's way. The principal had initially been hesitant about his involvement, but his gentle manner and obvious dedication to helping children had quickly won over staff and families. Judge Santos had continued to follow Marcus's progress through the Veterans Treatment Court program, and she often cited his case when speaking at judicial conferences about alternative sentencing approaches for veterans. Her decision to focus on treatment rather than punishment had not only saved Marcus's life, but had also influenced policy changes that benefited hundreds of other veterans throughout the state. The financial aspects of Marcus's recovery had required careful planning and community support. The combination of disability benefits, part-time employment, and speaking fees provided enough income for basic needs while allowing him to focus on recovery and service activities. Several local businesses had provided employment opportunities that accommodated his therapy schedule and recognized the value of hiring veterans. Dr. Williams had documented Marcus's recovery as part of a larger research study on effective treatments for combat-related moral injury. His case had contributed to scientific understanding of how military snipers process their experiences and what therapeutic approaches were most effective for addressing their unique psychological challenges. The research had implications for preventing similar problems among active duty service members and improving treatment for veterans already struggling with moral injury. The Veterans Affairs Office where Marcus had first sought help had hired him as a part-time peer support specialist, providing official recognition of his skills and experience. The position involved conducting outreach to isolated veterans, facilitating support groups, and serving as a bridge between clinical staff and veteran clients who might be hesitant to trust mental health professionals. His military background and personal recovery story gave him credibility with veterans who had been resistant to traditional treatment approaches. Marcus's speaking engagements had expanded beyond veterans organizations to include law enforcement training, judicial education, and community awareness events. He spoke about the importance of recognizing PTSD symptoms, the effectiveness of treatment-focused rather than punishment-focused approaches to veteran-related offenses, and the critical role of community support in successful recovery. His presentations were always carefully balanced between sharing personal experience and providing educational content based on current research. The anniversary of Marcus's arrest had passed without the psychological crisis that had characterized previous trauma anniversaries. Instead, the date had become an opportunity for reflection and gratitude. Marcus used the anniversary to speak at events focused on preventing veteran suicides and promoting early intervention for PTSD. His message was always clear: recovery was possible, help was available, and seeking treatment was a sign of strength rather than weakness. The support group continued to evolve and expand, with plans for additional meetings in neighboring communities and specialized tracks for different types of military experience. Marcus was working with Dr. Williams to develop a training curriculum that could be used to establish similar programs in other regions. Their goal was to create a replicable model that could help communities throughout the country better support their returning veterans. Looking back on his journey from decorated Marine sniper to struggling veteran to community leader, Marcus often reflected on the role that crisis had played in his transformation. Without the arrest and court appearance that had forced him to confront his problems, he might never have sought treatment or discovered his capacity to help others. The moment that had initially seemed like complete failure had actually been the beginning of a new purpose that was more meaningful than anything he had previously imagined. The young man who had once protected civilians in Afghanistan had found a new way to serve his community, this time by protecting vulnerable veterans from the invisible enemies of trauma, isolation, and despair. Marcus Thompson had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with rifles and military precision, but with compassion, vulnerability, and the courage to seek help when it's needed. His story had become proof that redemption was possible and that the warrior ethos of leaving no one behind applied as much to the home front as it did to foreign battlefields.